generously agreeing to host this hearing on a new report that the Breakthrough Institute and the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation are releasing today, called Rising Tigers, Sleeping Giant, Asian Nations Set to Dominate the Clean Energy Race by Out-Investing the United States. So we will, I think, have a fair amount of time for Q&A when we get there. What we want to do is start off with a summary of the report. Then we'll turn to Klein for some questions, for some comments, and then we'll make some other comments here. So let me start off by quickly introducing the panelists and speakers. We start with Congressman Klein. Congressman Ron Klein represents Florida's 22nd Congressional District. He was elected to Congress in 2006, sworn in 2007. He's a member of the House Financial Services Committee and the House Foreign Affairs Committee. He's also a member of the New Democrat Coalition in the House, and in particular, related to this hearing, he has been appointed head of the Coalition's Energy Task Force and is working hard on alternative energy legislation and particularly technology. So we're really pleased and honored to have Congressman Klein here. I am Rob Atkinson. I'm president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, which is a think tank that focuses on innovation. Just immediately to my left is Michael Schellenberger, and Michael is president and the co-founder of the Breakthrough Institute. For those of you who don't know, the Breakthrough Institute it is, I would argue, the leading think tank in the world on the relationship between innovation and environmental challenges, particularly climate change. They do, I think, the best work in the world on this question. Michael has a long background in the environmental movement. He and Ted Nordhaus, his colleague, wrote an award-winning book, The Death of Environmentalism, and so it was an essay. It was an essay, a long essay, very controversial, but got a lot of coverage. He's been named by Time Magazine Heroes of the Environment 2008. That's sort of like Heroes of the Soviet Union, that thing that you know. And it's written for a number of different journals. Jesse Jenkins will follow. Actually, Jesse will lead off. Jesse is at the Breakthrough Institute. He's director of energy and climate policy. He is a leading analyst on climate change and energy. He's co-author of a number of different reports, including Make Clean Energy Cheap, Jumpstarting a Clean Energy Revolution, the National Energy Education Act proposal, and others, and has extensive experience there. And then finally, we're pleased to be joined by Bill Marin. Bill is with Applied Materials, and unfortunately, Bill, I don't have your bio, but Bill, Applied Materials, as you will learn, is a leading supplier of semiconductor materials, but has moved into the solar cell space, and I think we wanted to get an industry perspective on how this challenge is shaping up, and what are the competitive challenges and opportunities for U.S. companies that could move into this industry. So with that, we're going to hear initial framing from Jesse to talk about what this report found, how we did it, and then we'll hear from Congressman Klein.
Thanks for joining us, and again, thanks to the Energy and Research Committee for hosting us today. We really appreciate it. So we set out with this report, Rising Tigers, Sleeping Giant, to look at a little bit deeper at some of the news stories you probably see every day these days about investments and firms in China, South Korea, and Japan, moving ahead rapidly to develop capacities in clean energy technology, both in the innovation and technology leadership, as well as manufacturing and production, and then also, of course, urging markets in those countries for clean energy technology, where domestic demand is growing quickly. We wanted to look behind some of those news stories and see if we can get a comprehensive look at both the current status of the competitive position of U.S. versus Asian industries in clean technology, as well as the government strategies launched by each of these countries to help strengthen their competitive position. What we found is that the United States lags behind in nearly every indicator that we looked at when it comes to clean technology, innovation, manufacturing, and demand, or domestic markets. And the governments of each of these countries, Japan, South Korea, and China, are launching more aggressive, more direct, and more targeted and strategic policies to help lengthen that lead. So I'll begin by just sketching some of the findings of our sort of competing industry snapshot. We're where we look closely at 6 particular technologies in the clean tech space, not meant to be exhaustive, but meant to be indicative of the overall sort of positioning of the industry, and of course focus on 6 in particular that are both hotly contested for international markets, and also of course core technologies expected to play a major role in transitioning the energy mix of both the developed world and the developing world towards cleaner energy sources. That includes wind and solar power, nuclear power, and carbon capture and storage technology for fossil fuel power plants, as well as advanced vehicles like plug-in hybrid electric vehicles and the batteries that will power them, as well as high-speed rail. What we found is that the United States has a slight edge in research and innovation, but is only inches behind the United States is Japan, which levels a similar amount of both investment in R&D activities, as well as secures an almost equivalent number of global patents, which is one of the metrics we look at to gauge the success of innovation policies and industries in each of these countries. Furthermore, both China and South Korea are ramping up their activities in the space, particularly South Korea, which is investing over the next 5 years a full 1% of their national wealth, or GDP, in its strategy to grow their clean technology prowess and expand their share in global markets. When it comes to manufacturing, the U.S. lags at least one of its Asian competitors in manufacturing of all 6 of the technologies we consider in this report. China produces 2 times as many wind turbines as the United States now, and China and Japan each produce 4 times as much solar power capacity as the United States each year. The U.S. now lacks the heavy forging capacity necessary to produce large components for nuclear reactors, and our capacity to produce some of the smaller components and technical components is flagging as well. Carbon capture and storage technology is in its early stages, but according to GE CEO Jeff Immelt, China is advancing faster to develop this technology, and just this morning I was reading the Wall Street Journal, Duke Energy is now partnering with Chinese firms to import CCS technology for use in their power plants in the United States. So we're in early stages of this technology, but look poised potentially to see technological leadership in production as well. The race is on, of course, for plug-in hybrid and electric vehicles. China's BYD released a plug-in hybrid car to the Chinese market in 2009. GM's Chevy Bolt is scheduled for release at the end of next year in the United States. But of course, the United States lags far behind when it comes to the production of batteries, the advanced lithium-ion and other batteries that will power these vehicles. And of course, exemplary of that is the fact that GM's Chevy Bolt will be importing the batteries to power the vehicle from South Korea's LG Chemical. And of course, when it comes to high-speed rail, the United States is hardly even in the game. We have no producers of domestic high-speed rail technology. In contrast, of course, Japan, which has led in the technology since the 1960s, has over 14 different designs that they produce different trains in Japan. And now both China and South Korea have localized production of their own high-speed rail designs and are looking to export markets in Turkey, Australia, Brazil, and elsewhere. When it comes to markets, the U.S. of course is a major consumer of energy and energy products. So the U.S. leads in both wind and solar markets at this point, but China is scheduled to pass in demand for solar panel or for wind turbines this year. And Japan is restarting its industry growth in solar demand with a new feed-in tariff policy and government procurement strategy to restart their solar industry. China is, of course, the world's largest market now for high-speed rail technology as they build a nationwide high-speed rail system to link all of their major cities by 2030. They spent $50 billion in 2009 alone constructing high-speed rail technology. China and South Korea outpaced the United States in nuclear plant construction. The U.S. has several permitted plants are in the permitting process, but has 0 actively under construction at this time, whereas China has 16. And of course, well, the upshot from all of this is the United States is starting the clean energy race from a deficit. And then of course that implies when it comes to strategies embarked upon by the U.S. government in order to help support the position of U.S. industries and the U.S. economy in this burgeoning and competitive sector, that means the U.S. has to do that much more to get ahead. Unfortunately, as we turn to the second part of this report, the governments of each of these nations, Japan, South Korea, and China, what we dub Asia's clean tech tigers, have launched strategies to extend their lead while the United States has not done enough to catch up. We examine the investments and policy support in each of these 4 countries provided for these clean technologies, particularly with a focus on policies to support research and innovation capacity, active support for manufacturing, and support for demand and domestic consumption. And what we find is that the Asian countries we look at are planning on investing over the next 5 years, from 2009 to 2013, over $500 billion to support the growth of these industries. In contrast, the United States is poised, even if we pass currently pending energy and climate legislation, to invest just $172 billion, or a 3-to-1 gap behind our Asian competitors. China alone is going to invest nearly $400 billion, and of course is the largest component of the Asian total. But South Korea, with an economy 1/14 the size of ours, is investing a full 1% of their national wealth to grow in these industries. The policies enacted in each of these countries are both more targeted and more direct than those currently relied upon in the United States. A report by the investment giant Deutsche Bank confirms that the policy environment created by each of these 3 countries, particularly Japan and China, provides more investor certainty for the private market and is likely to attract more private sector investment in addition to the public investments that already outpace the United States by a factor of 3 to 1. Many of these policies are specifically designed to cross one of the largest hurdles to the introduction of new clean technologies, the price gap between clean and conventional energy sources. Targeted policies like feed-in tariffs, government procurement, and other incentives are designed to bridge the gap between fossil fuels and their cleaner alternatives and help provide the early market demand necessary to spur clean technologies into the market. Many of these policies also focus on establishing infrastructure that enables the access to clean technologies, including recharging infrastructure for plug-in hybrid and electric vehicles, and electric grid expansion or smart grids, which help provide access to wind and solar power markets. In contrast, the United States is relying on, in the past, on a sort of stop-start series of more indirect policies and tax incentives to try to incentivize private sector investment, has not focused substantially on building out its infrastructure, and is poised in currently pending energy and climate legislation not to fill the investment gap. And I believe Michael will talk a little bit more about that. So that's broad strokes the content of this report. I think it's sobering news in a technology industry that offers perhaps the largest growth potential of any major sector of the economy at this point. And we'll have a little more, I think, for that by context.
Okay. Thank you, Jesse. That's very helpful. Dr. Klein.
Thank you. And now for the good news. Obviously, very good, sobering information, and the most important thing we can do as a country on the public and private side is to have valuable assumptions that are fact-based in front of us so that we can make intelligent decisions based on the common sharing and understanding of the facts. And this accumulation of information is very helpful. So thank you for putting it together, and very happy to be part of the panel today. I guess where I would start very simply is I think the United States for many years has been caught up, and this is probably where you're going to go with your conversation, in this discussion of it's an environment or it's business. And it's one or the other. Either you can be promoting the environment and all the safeguards and issues associated with that, or you can do business. And if you're doing more with the environment, you're damaging business. If you're doing more with helping business, you're damaging the environment. And I think Al Gore, or some along the lines, along the way, began the conversation. It doesn't have to be that way, and it isn't that way if you plan properly and bring in the necessary partners to figure out then how to promote both ends of the equation. The United States has been very slow in terms of, you take some simple models like solar, or just any other alternative energy in the European Union community, where they created performance portfolio standards in terms of creating market, which you talked about, that stimulated investment. I mean, any business worth their salt is going to say, well, I'm going to invest in something if I know there is a long-term opportunity to get a return on investment and is a growth potential. If you have, like we do in the United States or any one of our states that has a 2-year R&D tax credit, or a 1-year fund that you're going to be able to dip into and then it's gone, that has very little, I mean, people will grab it, but it has very little long-term ability to change the ability to produce, innovate, and sell products in a long-term planning stage. So I think that, you know, what we have going on right now, and I think in a very positive discussion, is you have national leadership that is taking this on head-on. Unfortunately, you know, the Congress is picking up different signals from different sectors of the business community. Some, such as myself, believe very strongly that this offers the largest potential of growth in our economy of anything we can do. I mean, yes, there are other areas, I'm not meaning bioinformation issues or other types of sectors, but this one is particularly good in many ways because it's home-based, it's real estate-based in the United States. We have the demands and the issues are right here. We need energy right here, it has to be produced. You can't buy it overseas, you know, in terms of the actual production of energy, for example. You can buy products overseas, and that's what we do, but ultimately, you can do good things here. And I'll give you one simple example from my home state of Florida. I had a conversation with a large proprietary producer of power in Florida, and they were in the process of building one of the largest photovoltaic installations in the United States. This is after many years where this company just kept its head buried in the sand. Solar power, we don't get enough sun, it's off and on. This is Florida, the Sunshine State. You know, we had these conversations, but they have new leadership now, and to their full credit, they've been very involved and really taking it in different directions. They're building this very large installation in Arcadia, Florida. President Obama came down recently to this installation. And what the CEO said to me is, we have to import all of our mirrors from Germany because there's nobody in the United States that produces the quality and the quantity of the product we need. So the cost associated with the hard costs and the shipping costs, the transportation costs, to bring this equipment here to the United States is very, very high. If, in fact, we produce this product in Georgia or Florida or somewhere in the region, they estimate it would cost about 1/2, including all of our costs associated with producing in the United States that people say drives the cost higher. By the way, Germany has some of the highest labor costs in the world, but you know they've been able to build up their portfolio over the years because of their own internal performance standards and building market. So it's an example to me that really jumps out, and we can go from industry to industry in terms of why these things haven't happened, of an area where if we as a country said, all right, we're going to take certain steps, creating market, there may be some long-term tax incentives, could be lots of different strategies that are out there, to produce and innovate and encourage investment in this type of equipment. We have a whole country just within the United States that would be very interested in buying any one of these alternative energy products that produce electricity. Same thing with the electric car and the batteries. Another example that I'd like to cite to is a piece of equipment a smart grid kind of equipment. But if you think about your basics right now in your home or your industry, you've got a meter. Remember those meters on the outside of your home? It's the same meters they've had for a long time. But those meters, you get a little revolving, horizontal disc that is measuring the amount of power. Go look at your when you get home today, and it has little, digits and lots of different things that's measuring how much power, and that obviously goes into your billing cycle. As a consumer, you have no idea how much you're consuming. You get a bill at the end of the month. No concept. Well, if we had equipment that, number one, allowed us to not only be aware of what we were spending and consuming, which as a consumer, you may make some consumer choices in conservation or maybe do things a little differently, but beyond that, if you had additional equipment which allowed you as a consumer, residential consumer, to purchase power during the least costly periods of time when we produce power, we have a capacity in the middle of the night, for example. These are examples of where you as a consumer will probably be able to buy less. You actually have a gap of capacity that's there without us even adding more equipment. We will need to continue to do that, but all these kinds of things are out there in terms of technology that we can obviously use in the United States and spread all over the world and license and sell and all those kinds of things. So I am absolutely bullish on the fact that our innovative opportunities, our universities, our businesses, we collaborate, encourage, and give the necessary long-term strategies, not 1 or 2 year thinking here, but the long-term views that examples you heard about in other countries. These are the kinds of things that are absolutely necessary where we will have to make these kinds of commitments and say, yes, this is something that is not only important to our country, for our economy, it's a matter of national security and all the other things that are important to us, But this is a huge opportunity, just as there have been other opportunities during the Industrial Revolution where the United States has led the way. This is a new day, a new age. Other countries are emerging very rapidly. Obviously, we know some in the Far East, some in Europe, and other places, and we have to put our foot down and say, we as a country have to make this as a national commitment. We got to get over this nitpicking on, the Senate's doing it this way, the House, and obviously the Senate and the House are just reflecting what's going on in the community, in the business community. And I really, challenge our business community in many ways to be the leaders here. By keeping our head buried in the sand, we're just getting farther and farther behind. There are great companies, such as yours, who get it. And there are other companies, as in this whole energy debate, that are going to do it the old way. And, it works, and status quo, but we can make our numbers on a quarterly basis, and it works for our shareholders, and I get it. I mean, this is all about return on investment, but we believe that the long-term view for these companies, proprietarily, as well as the United States as our greatest economy, the most innovative economy, demands that we take this type of action and we do it now over the next number of months and years and build on it. So, we stand ready to work with all of you, and of course, I'll just use this as an opportunity to say that all of you are out there in the field, you have various experiences, backgrounds, industry and otherwise, and please, as we work through these things and you review the materials here and the organization itself, please reach out to me and other members of Congress who have an interest in this thing with your ideas, your thoughts. What do you think are the best strategies that you think will work long term to keep us where we need to be in this important area?
Thank you. Great. Thank you, Congressman. I know you have to run in 2 minutes, so or maybe go out a little bit of order. Just maybe we have time for 1 or 2 questions for the Congressman if anyone has them before he has to go. Okay. Fine. Yeah.
I do, actually. I'm curious to know, you say the inertia or the lack of action in this investment in Congress is reflective of what's going on in the country. Could you spotlight 2 or 3 really big impediments to greater investment here? Is it that the price of gasoline comes down so nobody cares about renewables, or is it the big lobbying interests for the various renewable sectors? What is preventing us, because we keep talking about it and China and others just blow us out of the water?
Well, the question for those who did the question is, what are the impediments that are stopping us from taking these steps forward, whereas other countries, some of which operate in a more efficient government form, shall we say? A dictatorship is a very efficient form of government, and you can make lots of decisions without having to deal with a parliamentary system, which has its say in the process. But that's not the only answer. First of all, I think the American people are very much engaged now. And, obviously at this moment, they're thinking jobs and the economy. But I think one of the best things we can do is we can translate this issue into jobs and the economy. Obviously, we've already passed a number of pieces of legislation, including stimulus, which talk directly about how we can sort of build these industries. But it's not just a one-shot deal. I mean, there's got to be a continuing drumbeat about why this is important. And ultimately, Congress gets its power from individuals and the opinion of the American people on where they go. But again, I would say there are a lot of people, including the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and I'll just be very straight out on that has been very resistant to changes. And really, they'll say, yes, we need to do this, but they'll do everything they can to block it. Now, I'm not telling you the cap and trade is the right answer one way or another. I know what I voted for, what I haven't voted for, what I believe, what I don't believe. But collaboratively, we as a country have got to put the smartest heads together, Republican and Democrat, business and public and private, and say, here, these are the things, here's where we excel, here's where we can be good. Maybe trains aren't going to be our thing, okay, and that just may be a reality. But boy, there are a whole lot of other things that we should be continuing to be at the top of the game and developing this next generation of leadership. So, I don't want to just pick on the Chamber of Commerce, but, I literally challenge our business community, and there's those in our business community that really stepped out. There's a group called U.S. CAPS, for example, which was involved in the energy debate, which is a combination of, Dow Chemical, Exxon, labor unions, environmental groups. It was actually a very interesting combination of people, but it was that kind of leadership that I saw that was very positive, as opposed to a lot of the traditional industrial companies in the United States that have sort of held back and said, well, our power prices are going to go up, therefore. Well, let's find answers to that. We understand that. Nobody's looking to just create a jolt of expense There needs to be gradual changes which will ultimately make them more efficient, more profitable, and everything else. So, but I think instead of sort of people just saying, can't do it, how can we do it? How can we come together and find the right ways?
I think we have time for just one more question. Yes, sir.
If the country should move ahead on low carbon legislation and on low carbon investment, how can you and how can legislators in the other side of the state talk to people whose livelihoods are predicated on fossil fuels?
Well, again, to me, it isn't a question of saying that, you're getting rid of coal, for example. You've got a major amount of coal. You have many power producing plants in the United States are coal-based, so you're not going to switch off coal. And there are certain fossil fuels that are more damaging than others, and even within the coal, there's low sulfur and high sulfur and lots of different things here. I think part of the answer is we have got to figure out technologies and responses to these things. And there may not be answers, but there may be answers. And to me, it's really focusing on, there's an economic, from a business point of view, there's an economic opportunity here. If you can figure out a way to make coal, I'll use coal for example, as something that is more efficient, less damaging the environment. Okay, it's part of our system right now. It's part of China's in a very big way and around the world. Is there an answer, a technological, scientific answer to environmental issues? I'm not the one to answer the question, but I think to the extent that we can sort of really focus a lot of attention and resources on scientific answers, many times there are scientific answers to these things. So I think we have to talk that way and not just talk, follow through that way with making the necessary investments. If there was an answer to the coal situation, that's something we can not only make great use of in the United States with a massive amount of inventory of coal, but around the world, it can be a massive opportunity for jobs and licensing of technology and resources.
Great. Well, thank you, Dr. Klein. Really appreciate taking the time out of your schedule and joining us. So with that, we'll turn over to Michael. I think you were good. That's good. So a couple of things, by the way. One is there are some copies of the executive summary over there. There's also, unfortunately, the report is so long we didn't get a chance to print enough of them, but the full report is going to be on our website and the Great Figures website, so I encourage you to look at that. I think when we sort of reflect on what we've heard so far today, a couple of things stand out. One is these are all smaller nations than us. Even China, with a significantly smaller GDP than the U.S. GDP. And in many of these sectors, they're taking absolute leads or at least parity on investment. So on a per GDP basis, they're significantly ahead of us in many of these areas. Secondly, these countries all have strategies. They have thought this through. They're not just sort of willy-nilly kind of relying on the market wisdom, nor are they simply just throwing money at things that pop up. They have coherent strategies they've adopted, and they're funding them with relatively significant levels of investment, both on the tax side, the procurement side, direct support. When we think about this issue, though, I think one of the things that we hear a lot is that we're going to have to basically kind of take the rationale for taking the castor oil of carbon pricing, which we all none of us want to do, and it's painful, is that we'll get the dessert of this high-growing, high-wage, clean energy industry. And that's kind of a compelling political narrative. We heard our client talk about that narrative. The problem is that one of the things that pricing will do is it will create certainly some demand. You can have an argument about how much demand pricing, whether it's cap and trade or carbon tech, will create, but clearly it will create demand. And as Jesse alluded to, we are and will be the world's leading consumer of clean energy technology. The problem is that while demand will ultimately create supply, the supply doesn't necessarily have to be in the U.S. So I think there's a real risk that there will be this amazing energy revolution that we will be a large consumer of, but frankly, not a large producer of. So that suggests to me that we have to have a clean energy industry policy. We need to have a strategy. We need to support it at an adequate level. What are some of the arguments against that? Let me suggest 4 arguments that I think you will hear or you may have that would say, wait a minute, maybe we shouldn't do this. 2 of them are around the issue that it doesn't matter, and 2 of them are around the issue that we will win anyway. The first one is that it doesn't matter is ultimately, what do we care where things are produced? What we care about is low prices. So if the Chinese are going to subsidize solar panels, that's all good. It accrues to us. We get cheap solar panels. What's not to like about that? What's not to like about that is that this kind of overarching focus on consumer welfare in our economic thinking sort of neglects the fact that the vast majority of consumers are actually workers. So my mother-in-law is actually not a worker, but she's a consumer because she gets Social Security, and my daughter is not a worker, she's a consumer. I give her money to live on. She gets to eat at my house, and I get to give her free rent. She's only 3 years old. But most people, actually, consumers and workers are the same. So the value that having a strong worker sector, if you will, accrues to consumers. And there's a very nice study in Monthly Labor Review, if you read Monthly Labor Review, the BLS Journal, Scholarly Journal, June 2009 article that analyzed wage growth in the U.S. from 2002 to 2007. And what it found was that the average wage growth was 11 cents per hour. Now, you say that's big or small, it's a pretty irrelevant point. If you just measured wage growth by sort of firms paying more money on average, it was 22 cents an hour. So if you're in an average firm, you got 22 cent an hour raise over that 5-year period. However, and that leaves out healthcare and other things like that. But if you look at what the real effect was, it was 11 cents. What's the difference? The difference was that there was a minus 11 cent reduction in U.S. wages through occupational shifts. So we shifted our occupations and our industries over that 5-year period from higher wage industries to lower wage industries. And because of that, overall, there was a downward pressure on U.S. wages. So in other words, we shifted maybe from a semiconductor job to a hamburger job. That would lower your average wages. So that's why it's important to focus on the structure of the jobs we have in the U.S. The great advantage of the clean energy industry, besides the fact that it's central to solving global warming, is that it will produce, on average, higher value-added jobs than the average job in the U.S. and higher wage jobs than the average wage in the U.S. The second argument you'll hear about why it doesn't matter is it doesn't really matter as long as if Applied Materials is successful that they're making all of their equipment in China, or the GE is making their wind turbines in China. That doesn't matter. Those are U.S. firms. We're good to go. And again, that argument, frankly, I would rather, if we're going to import stuff, I'd rather, frankly, be importing from a U.S. firm. We get at least some of the benefits of management, profits, and design and things here. But we certainly don't get as many benefits if we were doing the entire production system here, R&D all the way down to production. So this notion somehow that as long as U.S. firms win, we win, again, I don't think that's certainly not the future. Then I think there's two arguments that say essentially, look, we don't need to worry about this stuff. You know, if they're investing that, you know, good for them, but we're going to win. We're going to win because we got this sort of dynamic economy with more entrepreneurial, we have more VC, more venture capital. Well, actually, we're not the most entrepreneurial economy in the world, and we're certainly not the most, don't have the most VC in the world. If you look at the recent study we did on the Atlantic Century. But leaving that aside, there's a big difference, though, between this set of innovations and the venture capitalist who's on our advisory council was talking to me the other day. Said, you know, I don't know how much longer I'm going to be in business because I've spent my entire career focusing on IT, venture capital and IT. And IT is evolving rapidly to a point where you don't need a lot of money to start a really good company. You can use open source, you can use low-cost programmers, you can really build an amazing company without a large amount of money. I mean, a few million kind of thing. You simply can't do that in the clean energy sector. Pete Engardo of Business, we had a cover story on that in June this summer, talking about the scale that's needed to win in this sector. Whether it's wind, solar, batteries, you need massive scale, both on the R&D side and the production side. And so our kind of ability to allocate and marshal small amounts of capital to the VC side is very important and useful, but it's not going to be enough this time. And the last argument is essentially, well, it's okay if those guys get ahead of us, we'll catch up because we'll do leapfrog innovation. So they might do something other, but we'll invent the next thing. A couple of problems with that. One is, historically, the reason the U.S. is done well is because we have had leadership positions. And once you're in a leadership position in these, particularly in these sectors, you have scale economies, you have other sorts of first mover advantages that make it very hard to catch up. So these first mover advantages include, for example, high entry costs, as I mentioned. You know, you can invent, if you've got scale on solar panels, you just can't jump into the solar panel because you get high entry costs. Second thing is you have price declines through learning economies and scale economies. The more you produce, the lower the price is. It makes it very hard for that new entrant to come into a marketplace once it's established. And lastly, you have this notion of what economists would call externalities or external economies, what we would term clusters. You end up with a supportive ecosystem of R&D facilities, training programs, universities, all oriented around winning and having advantage in this technology sector. So it's not as if we can somehow we'll let them sort of dominate, they'll drive down costs, they'll build this ecosystem, and somehow magically we'll have this really cool invention that comes out of Caltech, and whoa, we'll take the market over. It's not that simple. We have that advantage, but if we can't translate that all the way down the production line, I simply don't think we're going to be able to do this. So I would argue this is kind of a new world for us, where we don't have a lead. We're in an innovation sector system that requires a whole set of different capabilities, and I think these other countries certainly have the ability to win. I'm not predicting they will win necessarily, but they certainly have the capability to win, and I think that's what's new with that. So with that, I think Michael will talk a little bit about sort of why this whole thing is important from an environmental perspective, and then we'll close with comments from Bill.
Thanks everybody for coming. I'm going to start by speaking directly to the question that you asked. I think it's probably a question on a lot of folks' minds, which is, why is it that we're not doing this? And it's not. I think the reason that the congressman gave was, well, there's big firms, big fossil fuel interests, big industrial interests that have an interest in maintaining cheap sources of energy. But I think there's actually a more fundamental obstacle, and that's the neoclassical ideology that says that the government should not be picking technological winners and losers. And I would suggest this is actually, if this had been the governing ideology in much of America's history, we wouldn't have cheap food because of major U.S. government investments in agricultural R&D for better seeds, better fertilizers, better pesticides. We created the land-grant colleges to create a whole generation of agricultural engineers. If this had been Abraham Lincoln's ideology, we wouldn't have had his push for the railroads, his earlier push for the canals. If it had been Eisenhower's ideology, we would not have had the interstate highway system. We would not have had the Defense Department purchasing all the microchips that U.S. firms could make. The price of a microchip dropped from the late 50s from $1,000 a chip to less than $20 a chip, less than a decade later. If this neoclassical, we shouldn't pick winners and losers ideology had been sort of the American ideology, we wouldn't have invented the internet, that horrible white elephant, the internet. We wouldn't have computers, we wouldn't have wind turbines, solar panels, nuclear power plants, jet airplanes, we wouldn't have Silicon Valley. All of the mythology of Silicon Valley is precisely that. Fareed Zakaria, in a major piece in Newsweek this week, talks about how Silicon Valley is largely a construction of Defense Department demand for high technology products, starting with radios. Hewlett and Packard would not exist had the Defense Department not bought so many of their radios. And so the idea that we're going to go create these new industries in the United States through new regulations is really a very new idea, and one that would seem very strange if you were to go back in a time machine and propose that as a suggestion. People would say, well, yes, the Russians have just launched the Sputnik, but we're not going to go and actually start building computers and finding space race. We're going to go and create a cap-and-trade system on typewriters, and we're going to tax telegraphs in order to create the kind of high-tech information technology revolution that we need. It just seems absurd on face, and yet that is the equivalent of what we are doing when we think about creating a clean energy economy. I would note that I was here in Washington for the inauguration. I think President Obama gave an incredible inaugural address that spoke directly to these fears that America is a nation in decline. I would suggest that this calcified ideology that the government should not be procuring cutting-edge technologies, the government should not be picking technological winners and losers, that is the ideology of American decline. If we stay with that worldview, we are going to completely see the fastest growing industries in the world to Asia. I think the most, every time the more we look at this, you just read the newspaper today, you read about the deals that Duke is cutting, that GE is cutting with China, you can see this is what happens when you decide that the federal government should not be in the business of embracing new cutting edge technologies. But of course, the good news is that once that first mover advantage is established, and I think we make a pretty strong case that it is being established right now by Asia, it is not impossible to catch up. So obviously the Japanese not only caught up, but they passed us by. in auto manufacturing. We had the greatest cluster, the greatest industrial cluster of the time in Detroit. We let that slip, and the Japanese passed us by about being very intelligent about how they manufactured. Also a case study, the congressman mentioned the German example, but obviously there's this mythology that, well, no, we can't compete because we pay too high of wages. That's obviously not the case in places like Japan. In the case of pharmaceutical drugs, America's leadership was really cemented when we increased the National Institutes of Health budget to $30 billion a year. In a separate proposal, we've suggested we need National Institutes of Energy funded at $15 billion, maybe $30 billion for a focus on R&D. And there's really no shortcuts to this. President Obama announced a joint venture with China to do energy efficiency and other clean tech. But it was $150 million. That's 1/18 of what Goldman Sachs will pay out in bonuses this year. It's a fraction of the $15 billion that President Obama promised for R&D. That promise is actually still on the White House website. So we can kind of sit here and kind of wring our hands and say, boy, it's really terrible. We're losing these industries to Asia, but we can't do anything about it because that would involve the government picking technological winners and losers, or we can get back in touch with what we've always done, which is making smart investment choices in public goods and new public goods that will establish America's economic leadership today and for decades to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. And Bill.
Thanks, Rob. I told Rob I would keep my.
You want to move the mic?
I'm sorry. I told Rob I would keep my comments on the report brief. And so let me just say, I think my principal reaction to this is, duh. I'll try to deliver a little more articulate.
Thank you, Bill. Any questions?
Just by way of background, my company, Applied Materials, we're the world's largest maker of production equipment for solar panels. So we don't make the panels, we make the tools that actually make the panels. And what we found as we have entered this market is that policy really does drive markets. So if you don't have the right policy in place, you're not going to have the right market. And I think that's really the finding of this study. Why are we falling behind? Because we don't have the right policies in place. And just looking through this, this is almost a marketing guide for us. This is where the clean energy revolution is going to be. This is where my company is going to be. And that's one of the reasons we just opened the world's largest solar R&D facility in Xi'an, China. That's the market. I mean, what do you want us to do? That's where the business is going to be. That's where we're going. Also something, Rob, you said that these other countries have a plan. They do. I was in Singapore last week on the fringes of some of the APEC meetings, and I was really shocked by the amount of buzz and enthusiasm in the other APEC economies. They're not waiting for us. They're just not going to wait for us. They're not going to wait for us on trade, and they're not going to wait for us on energy and climate change either. They're going to go ahead, and if we catch up, that's fine, but they're not looking back at us. And just a final comment on what Representative Klein said about energy and the environment and business being at odds with one another. And it doesn't have to be that way. And it's certainly not that way at my company. We're looking at, we got into the solar energy business, we're also looking at LED technology, energy efficient glass, OLEDs, thin film batteries. So there's a whole range of opportunities out there. And this can be the next real industrial revolution, Michael, the things you were talking about, if we decide to put the right policies in place to seize the opportunity.
Yeah. Thank you, Bill. And I think it's the point I would stress to that. This is one of those sectors where we've got probably a window, sectors being broadly with the industries we're talking about, where we maybe have a window of about 10 years. And then the game is possibly over at that point. So there's still plenty of time to do this, but it needs expeditious leadership and action. And let me close by one last point, and then we'll open up for questions. I wrote a piece in Business Week earlier this summer, and I was talking about why innovation is central to solving climate change. And I use the analogy that we're talking about a climate change bill in the House that could have a carbon tax of $15 $20 a ton. And you look at a country like the Netherlands or France, Germany, where the carbon tax is $400 a ton. Well, when you buy a gallon of gas, you're paying a $400 carbon tax. And the number of electric vehicles in the Netherlands, anyone want to count them? You count them on one hand because the number is 0. So pricing alone is not going to get us to where we need to be. Pricing is a core component, but it's not enough. And when you have $400 a ton carbon tax and you don't get electric vehicles, it's not because there's not a demand, it's because there's not a supply. And the innovation has not come fast enough or far enough to do that. So that's why, at least in our view and the Breakthroughs' view, you have to have an innovation strategy to couple a price strategy. Those two go together. And if you don't have either of them, if you don't have the innovation strategy, you certainly will not get the industry here to anywhere to the extent that we think it can be and we hope it will be. So we have certainly at least 15 minutes, or maybe a little more questions. So if you could identify, raise your hand, identify yourself, and then Clyde.
I'm Clyde Prestwitz from the Economic Strategy Institute. Someone, maybe Jesse, I thought made the comment that for lack of large-scale forging capacity, we can't build nuclear reactors in the U.S. Is that correct?
We can't build the large-scale forged components such as the reactor containment vessels and pressure vessels needed, especially for the new generation reactors are like 1,400 megawatts in a lot of cases. So they need very large forging facilities, and there currently are none in North America capable of building that scale. And there are lots of other components to go to nuclear power plants. It's a huge engineering tool. So U.S. firms like Westinghouse and GE and others continue to produce components primarily right now for export since we have no demand for new plants in the U.S. But we can't build full nuclear power plants here in the United States without
Does that have
capacity.
any effect on the amount or location of research and development of other components related to nuclear reactors?
I'm not sure it does, but it probably impacts the formation of industry clusters around nuclear power. So that in Japan, with I think the largest heavy forging capacity of the countries we examined, they have the full supply chain and can cluster that design around both demand and the production. So I would say it's not impossible to produce other components here in the United States without that capacity, but certainly is a big component of the supply chain that's missing in the United States.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Go here.
Congressional Research Service. Can we build renewable energy industries in the U.S. without erecting barriers to trade?
Can we build an industry without erecting barriers to trade? Good question. I would argue we certainly can, but we need to do two things. One is we need to have our own proactive policies, and the second is we need to fight against other countries' barriers to trade. So this is, to me, a key point that this gets lost in a lot of this debate. The Chinese are erecting very significant barriers to trade. If you want to sell wind turbines in China, you have to produce them there. The idea is somehow that we can only do this on the sort of the promotion side, but not fight against their protectionist policies, which are dramatically higher than ours, particularly currency, by the way. That would be the easiest and so simple thing to address. You immediately get rid of a 40% price differential between the U.S. and China. So we don't have to be protectionist in other areas. There's no reason we have to do that. What we do have to do is fight their protectionism and have our own technology strategy.
I'll speak a little bit to the implications that we draw out of this report for policymakers, which is not among those as direct protectionist barriers. It's not one of our suggestions. But if you look at the strategies that are being implemented in the clean tech tigers in South Korea, China, and Japan, these are comprehensive strategies across the board to support what we identify as really the three key components of a strong clean energy sector, and that's research and development or research and innovation capacity, manufacturing capacity, and domestic markets. And we argue in the report that without support for all three of those, you risk ceding a large portion of the economic benefits and the competitive strength that comes with a strategy that focuses on all three. So I think the main recommendation is that we can't just focus on policies that incentivize demand, whether it's a carbon price or renewable portfolio standards for clean energy. You can't just focus on basic science and research either. The United States invented and commercialized the first generation of wind turbines and solar panels and nuclear plants And then we ceded those technologies to countries with more comprehensive strategies like Denmark that not only invested in demand but also manufacturing and research to scale up and improve wind turbines, and now as the leading wind turbine company by installed capacity investments. So our recommendations are threefold. First, that the United States government should significantly increase our support and investment in research, development, and demonstration of technologies. The demonstration phase being one that's particularly critical for large-scale, capital-intensive clean energy technologies, where you can't just go from the lab or even a pilot scale into production. You need to build the fully integrated commercial scale, kind of first of its kind demonstration. And that's an extremely risky proposition for the private sector, and one the public sector really needs to get involved in supporting. Second, that the United States government needs to actively support and spur the innovative manufacturing processes and the economies of scale in manufacturing and production that help establish the first mover advantages that Rob talked about. And third, that the United States government needs to actively support through targeted public policies, policies that can bridge the price gap and remove other key barriers to the deployment of these technologies in order to create a strong domestic demand and fully integrate the three components of this. So if we launch a proactive strategy like that, which is exactly what South Korea, China, and Japan are doing, we probably don't need to have anything protectionist. We'll be able to keep pace. And we do have the resources, we do have the capacity, we do have the technical expertise that if we level those in the right direction with the right strategy, we can win the clean energy race. But we're not doing any of those things right now with sufficient vigor or cohesion to win.
I mean, one quick thing we could do, which is beyond clean energy, but a lot of other countries in the last few years have expanded their R&D tax credits to allow process expenditures to be included. In the U.S., we now only allow product R&D to be credited in sort of R&D credit. There's all sorts of evidence, scholarly literature that shows there are big spillovers to process R&D, but we don't allow process R&D. A lot of our advantage in the sector is going to come from process R&D, not just product R&D, but other countries let them take the credit, we don't. So.
Kevin Finneran with Issues in Science and Technology at the National Academy of Sciences. You point out that we need to spend across a whole group of areas in order to be effective, but as you also know, there's a limited amount of money to spend, and I wonder if you drill down deep enough to look at where the United States, in which of these areas, the R&D, the manufacturing development, the market development, where we're particularly weak or strong, and also compared in how obviously it differs with each technology. I mean, we don't do the same thing for nuclear power as we do for photovoltaics, but also relative to these other countries that you looked at, where are they placing their emphasis and how they're spending their money so that we can both spend more and spend it smarter? What do you think we need to do?
Yeah, so the U.S., I mean, one of the findings is that the U.S. is the leader currently in investments in research and development. But that as you look at across all these countries and you look at the scale of the clean energy market, just the energy and transportation sector in the United States alone is nearly a $2 trillion annual market. So if you're thinking about the investments required to shift a market of that scale, we're not talking about the dog food industry or even the nascent computer industry where you had a very sort of a frontier industry growing from a very small scale into a large scale industry. We're talking about a very large established industry with trillions of dollars in revenue. So the investments being made by all of these countries in R&D, even though Japan and the United States currently outpace China and South Korea, are far too low when you look at the scale of the industry. I'd say over the next few years, we finally have a relatively stable policy environment when it comes to tax credits, at least, to incentivize solar and wind power, with an extension of the production and investment tax credits through 2012 and 2018. Without anybody able to take tax credits with profitable revenue right now, we're seeing that those kind of more indirect incentives, as opposed to the more direct production incentives offered in other countries, are limiting the efficacy of that policy as well, though, with profits able to take those tax credits right now. So in the stimulus, we had to create a much more direct incentive, which is temporary, and something we could look at extending, I think, in a more direct and long-term way to match the policies in other countries. When it comes to manufacturing support, there's very, very little other than temporary support in the stimulus bill. So we're off to a good start when it comes to many of the policies that we recommend are actually temporarily enacted and probably in a more clumsy way than we could if we had more time to think them out in the stimulus bill. The American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, but all of those are poised to fall off the funding cliff and to cede at the end of 2010 or 2011. And so we already need a much more long-term strategy across the board. I think that the other countries you asked about where other countries are making investments, I think they start from a position of looking at where both what their needs are in terms of domestic demand and also where their capacities currently lie. And I think, like the Congressman said, maybe trains aren't our thing. Maybe we're going to see high-speed rail in Japan, who's had a 40-year head start on us. You can make that decision. But the point is we have to look at our capacity and look at where our strategic needs are in terms of demand and make sure that we're launching strategies to fill those gaps and to support our industries. Otherwise, we'll simply import the technologies from overseas.
Just comment on that specifically in terms of solar and why we need all three of these pieces, and you can't just do one. To get to this price gap, it's really a policy. You need the right policies to help drive demand, which is going. We fund our R&D. We spend $1 billion a year in R&D, and the only way we can do that is from gaining market share and having the profits to do that. So. The market is going to drive investment, which will in turn drive R&D and also scale. Solar, for example, is very much driven by scale. Every doubling of production leads to a 20% drop in price. So the more you get out there, the cheaper it gets. So all of these things play into one another, and you can't knock any of the legs of the stool out.
With that, we're pleased to be joined by Congressman Rush Holt, and we've Q&A, but I thought I was going to introduce you first, and if you want to make a few remarks on what we've been focused on, that would be great. Those of you who don't know, Congressman Holt is only two physicists in the U.S. Congress. Is that right? Three, Mr. Ayers? Three.
And Bill Foster.
Okay. He's one of three physicists. He is a BA in physics from Harvard, and a PhD. He's a congressman from New Jersey. He's serves on the Committee on Education and Labor and Natural Resources and the Select Committee on Intelligence. But he's also on the New Democratic Coalition and also the Sustainable Energy and Environment Coalition. And he has focused significantly on on energy innovation. And actually, I think. Probably the only person on the panel who has a patent for a solar energy device. So he actually has experience in this area. And I also did not know a 5-time winner of Jeopardy, and that is very impressive. You will have to frame your answers in the form of a question.
Yeah, I decided whatever I might do in my career, what will be remembered is that I was on the game show Jeopardy. That's right. You've heard from panelists who have put a lot of thought and effort into understanding where we are in energy research, where we are compared to where we should be and compared to where others are. So I don't need to go into great length. I'm not as well prepared as the other panelists to do that. Nor am I really the person to do that. But I do want to make a few points. First of all, with great political effort, we passed in the House an energy climate bill this year that has many good features and fairly ambitious goals. But there is a gaping hole or shortcoming in that legislation, despite all of the effort and all of the thought that went into it. It falls short, on a critical point, which has to do with the ability to meet the ambitious goals of that legislation. The House bill would provide, through the creation of allowances, through putting a price on carbon, it would raise, in our expectations anyway, something like $1.5 billion, maybe $2 billion in new energy research dollars, and new energy research funding. The Senate bill, as it's under consideration, might raise an average of $2 to $2.5 billion. The Senate bill does have somewhat more front loading of the expenditures as one can best anticipate how it would roll out. In either case, in any case, that is frightfully short. Frightfully because the number one insult to our planet is the way we produce and use energy. We must, for the sake of our planet, change how we go about it. And for the sake of our national well-being, we should want to capture, earn a large part of the market that will necessarily result from this required change in the way the world produces and uses energy. It is usually, well, if one is on the right path, it is always better to lead than to follow. The risk is whether one is on the right path leading, whether one who is leading is actually on the right path. In this case, there's no mistaking that we must change the way we produce and use energy. And so we should seize that market. What is the appropriate expenditure on research and development? Well, I mean, there are various ways you can look at it. One is to say, in any business where the basic input for your business is in question because of supply, because you're poisoning your workers, because your supplier might not be reliable for any of those reasons, you might want to put 1% or 2 or 3 of your revenues into looking for other routes to conduct your business, in other words, other inputs. Well, if we have $1 trillion domestic economy in energy, $20 billion a year surely is not too much to spend. Maybe even $30 billion, if you look at it that way. Another way to look at it is to ask, well, what do we need to spend to accomplish the kinds of changes we need? Changes in the production and distribution of electricity, changes in transportation, changes in commercial, industrial, and residential technologies. And if we look at what it would take to replace the wasteful, inefficient, or unsustainable ways of conducting residential life or commercial and industrial business, again, we would come up with a number in the tens of billions of dollars a year in order to turn the supertanker around. Or another way to look at it, as the panelists here are, is to compare it to what other intelligent actors are doing. By any of those measures, we're coming up frightfully short. And you know, the warning signs are, seems to me, loud and clear. Whether we're outspent by these other countries by a margin of 2 or 3 or 4, it turns out to be, as you've probably heard today, difficult to calculate. It's difficult to know what these policies will, in the other countries, will actually result in spending. It's difficult to know, well, what is research and what is development and what is pushing the boundaries and what is just implementing what is a small changes. but on a large scale. And I really applaud the breakthrough and ITIF folks for doing a good job to get specific in this difficult area. And whether it's only 2 to 1, you know, if somebody disputes this and says, well, it's not really 4 to 1, or it's not really 3 to 1, it's only 2 to 1, it still puts us at an enormous competitive disadvantage. And so somebody's got to say this. And not many people are saying it. Much of the debate that has taken place in the House and the Senate has glossed over the fact that if you're going to have 80% reductions in carbon emissions, it's going to take an enormous investment, and it's going to take an enormous investment soon. If we're going to do something by mid-century that affects how we produce and use electricity, or transportation, or commercial and industrial processes, we better have the wherewithal and the know-how by, I don't know, 2025, 2030, maybe as late as 2030. That's only 15 or 20 years away. And we're talking about fundamental changes in how we produce and use energy. Sure, we can get, it's hard to say what percentage, but we can get some tens of percent reduction, perhaps, or a 10% reduction, or maybe even a 20% reduction in our carbon emissions using the technologies that are close at hand, either existing or well within reach. To get 80% is going to require fundamental changes in the way we produce and use energy. It's going to require things that we maybe have conceived of in some particularly creative laboratories or think tanks, but probably things that we haven't even conceived of in technology and behavior. That's going to require the kind of investment that no one is, except the folks here, are yet talking about making. And so I think it's really important that you're doing this. We've got to get cracking. It's got to be done. If we're going to have results that can actually be applied on a large scale a decade or 2 from now, just look back historically how long it has taken for different technologies, whether it's combined cycle gas turbines or any number of other technologies that you want to talk about, how long it has taken those from concept to application. You realize we're late. So we're frightfully behind where we should be, and where evidently, as we hear from the panel, where others are. So I applaud you for devoting time and attention to this. Glad to see some intent people in attendance, and I wish you every success, and I want to do anything I can to help get this information out.
Thank you very much. I think we actually, I know everybody sort of wanted to jump, but we got time for one more question, or maybe we'll start first, and then we will adjourn. Yes, right here.
My name is Prakash Ambedkar from Beijing Nation. In this table of the country, if you add EU and India, it should give us 3,000 or less stack up against each other. And if you could tell you horizontal part of the matrix, the 5 technologies we talked about, can you give us a winner and loser from each of them in the next 10 years that Rob mentioned? We have 10 years time for that.
As far as the EU and India and where they would stack in this, so we haven't, the amount of research in India is a comprehensive look across the board. means that I probably don't know the exact answer, but a recent report, actually I can't remember the authors, just came out this last week comparing the EU to China and India and the US, and found that the EU was slightly ahead of the United States, but certainly is still lagging behind China in particular. India is getting started in a serious way on a number of these technologies. In many ways, I think it's probably behind the three countries that we examined in this report in their own sort of indigenous technical capacity, but is moving rapidly on nuclear power, particularly on the next sort of fourth generation nuclear power plants, with assistance from U.S. firms. But they're farther ahead than any of the countries we look at the sort of next generation of nuclear power technologies. Is poised to invest, I think, $30 billion over the next 20 years to grow their solar markets and to improve their technology. So each of these countries is actively involved in the clean energy race as well. I wish we could have included them as well in terms of a fuller comparison. I think in interest of time, in terms of the technologies, we do try to stack up in this report where each country sort of heads out in the technology. So I would encourage you to download a full copy of it and look for the technologies that interest you there. So I think probably can't go through all of them right now.
Great. Well, with that, this has, I think, been hopefully a wake-up call. And I encourage you to go and look online for the full report. If you have questions or comments, please feel free to contact any of the authors here, including myself. So please join me in thanking our panelists, including